before the first city ever rose from the mud of Mesopotamia, before the first king ever claimed a throne, before humans even understood what kingship or law or civilization meant, the Sumerians believed something else already existed. Something older than humanity itself. They called them the Me, ancient divine decrees, cosmic laws, powers so fundamental that even the gods had to respect them. And according to the oldest texts we've ever recovered, these Me weren't created for humans. They were waiting for us, sitting in the treasure house of the gods, long before a single human city was ever built. Think about that for a second. A civilization that lived over 4,000 years ago was already telling stories about divine institutions that predated their own existence. Not gods creating humans and then figuring out the rules as they went along. No, the rules already existed, complete, perfect, eternal. And humans were simply handed them piece by piece, like inheriting a legal code written before the concept of writing even existed. If you're listening to this one to unwind, to fall asleep, to have something ancient and mysterious playing in the background while your mind drifts, that's exactly why I make these. So do me a favour, subscribe if you haven't, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love checking the comments and seeing it's 2 a.m. in Prague, sunrise in Manila, and midnight in Toronto, all at the same time, all listening to the same ancient mystery. And if you want the easiest way to support the show, listen on Spotify. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. And if you're enjoying what you hear, leaving a 5-star review takes 10 seconds but means everything. Links in the description. Now, today we're going deep into something most people have never heard of. The Sumerian Me, 7 of them in particular. 7 divine laws that ancient texts claim existed before any human civilization, before kingship, before priesthood, before the very concept of order itself. We're going to go through them one by one, in the order the ancient Sumerians themselves recorded them, uncovering what each one meant, why it mattered, and what it tells us about how one of humanity's earliest civilizations understood power, order, and the divine. And if ancient mysteries like this one fascinate you, I've put together a book covering 12 unexplained mysteries from across history, things that still don't have clean answers. It's available on the website, links in the description if you want to check it out after this. So settle in. We're about to travel back to a time before time, when the gods held the blueprint for civilization in their hands, and humans hadn't even entered the picture yet. Number 1. On this ancient list, the very first Me the Sumerians ever wrote down was Inship. Lordship itself. The raw concept of authority. The idea that someone, somewhere, could hold power over others and have that power mean something beyond brute force. But before we can understand why lordship mattered so much that it topped the list, we need to understand what these Me actually were. Because this isn't just some throwaway concept buried in dusty clay tablets. This is one of the strangest ideas to survive from the ancient world, and honestly, once you understand it, you start seeing its fingerprints everywhere in how later civilizations thought about power. So picture this. You're a Sumerian scribe sometime around 2100 BCE, sitting in the city of pressing a reed stylus into wet clay. You're copying down a story that's already ancient by your time. A story about a goddess named Inanna who travelled to the city of Eridu to visit the god Enki, and what she wanted from him wasn't gold, wasn't land, wasn't an army. She wanted the Me. Over 100 of them according to some versions of the tablets we've recovered. And Enki, apparently after one too many cups of beer, just handed them over. Just gave away the fundamental building blocks of civilization because he was feeling generous during a drinking session with his daughter. That story alone should tell you something. The Me weren't abstract philosophical concepts locked away in some untouchable divine vault. They were treated almost like objects, things you could possess, transport, steal, gift away by accident. The Sumerians described loading them onto what they called the boat of heaven, an actual vessel, to carry them from Eridu to Uruk. Think about that. Divine decrees, cosmic laws, the fundamental principles of civilization itself being ferried down a river like cargo. Now, scholars have spent decades trying to pin down exactly what the me was supposed to be, and honestly, that difficulty is part of what makes this so fascinating. There's no single, clean, universally agreed upon definition. Some researchers describe them as divine ordinances, fixed decrees that governed how the universe and human society were supposed to function. Others lean toward calling them cosmic powers, more like forces of nature that happen to be given names and personalities. Still others translate the concept closer to office or role, as if each me were a kind of job description handed down from the heavens, telling the universe exactly how each piece was supposed to behave. What we do know, based on the tablets that have survived, is that the me covered an almost dizzying range of human experience. There were me for kingship, obviously, but also me for priesthood, for the crafts, for music, for truth, for falsehood, for victory, for the destruction of cities, for the setting up of lamentation, even for something as specific as the art of woodworking or the making of judicial decisions. If you can think of an aspect of organized society, there's a decent chance the Sumerians believed a me existed for it, somewhere in that divine treasure house. And this is where it gets genuinely strange if you sit with it long enough. According to the mythology, these me existed before human civilization did. Before the first city, before the first king, before anyone had ever needed a law about kingship or priesthood or judicial decision-making, the concept already existed. Complete, sitting in Enki's domain in Eridu, waiting. It's a little like discovering an instruction manual for a machine that hadn't been invented yet, written thousands of years in advance, just sitting on a shelf, gathering dust, until someone finally built the machine and realized the manual fit perfectly. If you want more strange puzzles like this one, things ancient civilizations believed that still don't have tidy modern explanations, I put together a book covering 12 unexplained mysteries from across history. It's available on the website, and the link is right there in the description if you want to dig into it after this. Now, here's something worth sitting with for a moment. The Sumerians weren't writing fiction the way we think of it. When they wrote about the me, they believed they were describing something real, something that had actually happened, the way we might write a history textbook. To them, this wasn't mythology in the sense of make-believe. It was closer to how we'd treat a founding document, a constitution of reality itself. And within that constitution, the very first entry, the very first me listed in the oldest surviving texts, was Enship. Lordship, not kingship yet, not the throne, not the crown, not the scepter. Those come later on this list, each one adding another layer, another symbol, another piece of the puzzle. But lordship came first, before any of the objects of power, before any of the visible trappings of rule. There had to be the concept itself. The idea that authority could exist, that someone could hold a position above others, and that position could be legitimate, sanctioned, real in a way that mattered beyond just who had the sharpest spear or the largest group of followers. It's easy for us, thousands of years removed, to take that idea for granted. Of course, leaders exist. Of course, some people rule and others are ruled. But to the Sumerians, this wasn't something obvious or natural. It was something that had to be granted, something that came from outside humanity entirely. And that raises the question we're about to dig into next. What exactly made Enship so foundational that the Sumerians placed it at the very top of their divine list, ahead of everything else that would follow? And that question gets even more interesting when you look at what comes immediately after it. Because the order here doesn't feel random. The surviving Sumerian list moves from Lordship to Godship, then to the Exalted and Enduring Crown, the Throne of Kingship, the Exalted Scepter, Royal Insignia, and the Exalted Shrine. 7 entries in a row, all circling around the same dangerous human invention, power. But the first one is not a crown. It's not a throne. It's not even kingship. It's lordship. That distinction matters more than it might seem. A crown is an object. A throne is a seat. A scepter is something you hold in your hand. Royal insignia are the clothes, emblems, and ceremonial markers that let everyone in the room know exactly who matters most. Even kingship is a specific office, a defined role with a ruler at the top and subjects below. Lordship is more basic than all of that. It's the invisible thing underneath the visible things. The authority before the symbols of authority, the right to command before the chair, the staff, the robe, the palace, the procession, the guards, and all the rest of the machinery that makes rule look permanent. Think about a modern government for a second. A president can stand behind a podium. They can enter a grand building. They can have flags behind them, security around them, official seals printed on every document. But none of those things by themselves create power. Put a random person behind the same podium with the same flags and the same seal, and nobody suddenly has to obey them. The objects only work because people already accept the office behind them. The Sumerians seem to have understood that at a very deep level. Before you can have a crown, you need the principle that makes a crown more than expensive headwear. Before you can have a throne, you need the idea that sitting in a particular place gives one person a different status from everyone else. Before you can have a scepter, you need a world where a stick carried by one individual can represent the power to judge, command, punish, reward, and decide. Lordship is that first step, and in the sequence of the me, it comes before even Godship. That can sound almost backwards to modern ears. Surely the gods would come first, right? Surely divine status would be the foundation, and human rule would follow after it. But the list, at least in the form preserved in the famous Inanna and Enki tradition, puts Enship first and Dingiaship, Godship second. Now, we have to be careful here. Ancient Mesopotamian texts survive in fragments. They were copied across centuries, sometimes with variations, and Sumerian words can carry layers of meaning that don't fit neatly into a single English translation. We shouldn't imagine a committee of Sumerian philosophers sitting around a table and declaring, with absolute precision, lordship is conceptually more important than divinity. That's going beyond what the evidence can prove. But the placement is still there. The scribes put it first. And when ancient writers create a list, especially a sacred list, first place is rarely meaningless. It might suggest that lordship was not merely one institution among many. It may have been understood as a foundational force, something woven into the structure of reality before civilization ever appeared, not just a political arrangement humans came up with after a few arguments over land and grain. Something older, something built into the divine blueprint of how order itself worked. And that tells you a lot about how different the Sumerian mental world was from ours. Today, we often talk about power as something human beings construct. A leader gains support. A government writes laws. A military controls territory. A wealthy family buys influence. A revolution replaces one ruling class with another. In that model, authority rises from the ground up. It is made by people, maintained by people, and can be taken away by people. The Sumerian model could look almost upside down. Authority did not begin with humans. Humans received it, or perhaps borrowed it. The ruler was not the inventor of order. He was the temporary holder of something that had existed long before he was born and would remain after he died. That is a very useful belief if you're trying to build a stable society, because brute force has a problem. Everyone can see it fail. A strong man takes control because he has more fighters. Fine. But what happens when he gets old? What happens when a rival gathers even more fighters? What happens when drought hits, food runs out, and people start asking why they should obey him at all? Raw power is always unstable because it's always being tested. Every spear invites a larger spear. Every victory creates someone waiting for revenge. But if authority is something deeper, something woven into the order of the universe, then disobedience becomes more than a political act. It becomes a disruption, not just against a person, but against the proper arrangement of things. That's the kind of idea that can outlive individual rulers by centuries. And maybe that is why the list begins where it does. Not with a king who sits on the throne, not with the crown placed on his head, not with the temple that blesses his reign. It begins with the invisible claim beneath all of them. That hierarchy itself can be legitimate. Once that claim exists, everything else can be built on top of it. Godship can define the highest source of power. The crown can make power visible. The throne can give it a fixed location. The scepter can turn it into a tool of command. The royal garments can make it recognizable from across a crowded courtyard. The shrine can anchor it in sacred space. But none of those things mean anything unless lordship comes first. It's like building a city wall. The crown is the gate. The throne is the tower. The scepter is the weapon carried by the guard. But Enship is the foundation buried underground, the part nobody sees, the part everything else depends on. Remove the crown, and another crown can replace it. Remove the ruler, and another ruler can take his place. But remove the belief that anyone has a rightful place above anyone else, and the entire structure starts to shake. And that may be the real strangeness of this first entry. The Sumerians were not simply listing the tools of government. They may have been mapping out the anatomy of power itself, beginning with the one feature that has no physical shape at all. Because once you have lordship, the next question is unavoidable. If authority is real, if it exists as something greater than any individual ruler, then where does it ultimately come from? The answer in the Sumerian world was not supposed to be because he says so. It came from above. Every major city in southern Mesopotamia had its own divine patron. Uruk belonged to Inanna, Nippur belonged to Enlil, Eridu belonged to Enki, belonged to Nanna, the moon god. Lagash was associated with Ningirsu. These were not just religious mascots attached to places on a map. In the Sumerian imagination, the god was the true owner of the city. The fields were the god's fields. The canals were the god's canals. The storehouses, workshops, herds, fishing grounds, and temple lands all existed under divine protection. Human beings lived there, worked there, argued there, traded there, married, raised children, and occasionally tried very hard not to pay what they owed. But the city itself was not ultimately theirs. It belonged to the god, and that changes what a ruler is. The earliest Sumerian ruler was often called an Ensi, a word commonly translated as governor, city ruler, or lord. The exact meaning shifted over time, and scholars still debate how these offices developed. But the basic idea is clear enough. The ruler did not necessarily stand above the god as an independent monarch. He stood beneath the god as a representative, a manager, perhaps even a chief servant entrusted with keeping the divine household in order. That sounds humble. In practice, it was enormous power. Because keeping a god's household in order meant organizing nearly everything that mattered. Somebody had to make sure irrigation canals were cleared before the water season. Somebody had to settle disputes over fields. Somebody had to supervise labor gangs repairing dikes after floods. Somebody had to protect trade routes, manage grain reserves, direct temple workers, and respond when a neighbouring city decided that its border markers had suddenly become negotiable. In a world where one failed harvest could mean hunger, and one broken canal could ruin an entire farming district, administration was not boring paperwork. It was survival, and sacred authority gave administration a force that ordinary human authority might not have had. Imagine you are a farmer outside an early Sumerian city. A temple official tells you that your household must provide labour to repair a canal. You may not be thrilled about it. You have your own planting to do. Your family needs food. The mud is hot. The work is brutal. And the official probably has the personality of a wet brick. But this is not presented as one man's personal demand. The canal sustains the land. The land belongs to the city god. Maintaining it is part of preserving the proper order between the human community, the natural world, and the divine power that makes both possible. To refuse is not simply to ignore an official. It may be to endanger the whole city. That is what sacred authority does. It turns obedience into something more than fear of punishment. It makes duty feel cosmic. Of course, we should not romanticize this. Ancient rulers were human beings, and human beings have always been remarkably creative when given access to grain stores, tax records, armed men, and the right to announce that heaven agrees with them. The claim of divine legitimacy could unite communities. It could also justify inequality, forced labour, war, and the concentration of wealth in temples and palaces. A ruler could say, in effect, "This is not my decision. This is the God's order." And once you say that, arguing back becomes difficult. That may be one reason these ideas were so powerful for so long. Sacred authority solved a problem every growing city faced. How do you persuade thousands of people, most of whom are strangers, to cooperate? Family loyalty works in a village. Personal reputation works in a small band. But a city is different. A city needs people to obey rules made by someone they may never meet, contribute labour to projects they may never personally benefit from, and accept decisions that favour a larger whole over their immediate interests. You need a story big enough to hold everyone together. The Sumerians had one of the biggest stories imaginable. The gods had established order. The city existed within that order. The ruler was responsible for maintaining it. And if he failed, the consequences were not merely political. A drought could be read as divine displeasure. Military defeat could be understood as a god abandoning a city. Flooding, famine, disease, and social disorder were not random events in a meaningless universe. They could signal that something in the relationship between city, ruler, and deity had gone wrong, that put tremendous pressure on the person at the top. The ruler had privileges, absolutely. He could command labour, lead armies, oversee resources, and issue decrees. But he also carried the burden of proving that the city remained favoured. If the canals failed, if enemies broke through the walls, if grain disappeared from the storehouses, people had a very practical reason to wonder whether their lord still possessed divine backing. In that sense, ancient authority was never as secure as its monuments make it look. A brick inscription can call a ruler mighty. A statue can show him praying calmly before a god. A royal hymn can declare that justice flourished under his reign and abundance poured from the fields. But behind all that ceremonial language was a harder reality. The ruler had to deliver. The gods may have granted authority, but people still needed water, grain, safety, and predictable rules. And that tension is still with us. We still surround authority with rituals, symbols, legal language, uniforms, titles, buildings, and solemn ceremonies. We still want power to look legitimate, not merely powerful, because deep down, force alone has never been enough. People can obey force for a while, but for a society to last, they need to believe that the person giving orders has some rightful claim to do so. If you're fascinated by these ancient ideas and the mysteries that still surround the past, there's a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description. For the Sumerians, lordship was that claim in its earliest sacred form. Not a crown, not a throne, not even necessarily a particular man. It was the principle that someone could stand at the meeting point between human society and divine order, receive authority from a realm beyond ordinary life, and use it to hold a city together. But that raises an even more unsettling possibility. If lordship is authority granted by the gods, then what does it mean to possess the status of a god in the first place? That is where the next me takes us. Not to the ruler who governs in the name of heaven, but to the divine power from which heaven's authority was believed to flow. Number 2 on the list is Godship. And this one is strange because it sounds almost too obvious. Of course gods have godship. That is like saying fire has fireness or kings have kingness. But the Sumerian idea behind this word was not just a label pasted onto a divine being. It was a me, one of the fundamental powers said to make reality what it was. In Sumerian, the term is often translated as godship, divinity, or the state of being a god. The precise shades of meaning are difficult to recover after more than 4,000 years, and translations can make ancient concepts sound cleaner than they really were. But the core idea seems clear. Godship was divine status itself, not a particular god, not Enlil, the great power associated with wind and authority, not Inanna, connected with love, war, and terrifying ambition, not Enki, the god of fresh water, craft, and cunning intelligence, not Nanna, the moon god watching over Godship was the condition that made a god a god. Think about how unusual that is. The Sumerians were not only telling stories about powerful supernatural beings, they were treating divinity as something with its own existence, something so fundamental that it could be counted among the powers established before human political life took shape. Before there is a king, there must be kingship. Before there is a temple, there must be sacredness. And before anyone can receive commands from heaven, heaven must contain beings whose commands matter. That is what godship represents for us. It is easy to imagine religion as belief. You either believe in a god or you do not. But that is not quite how the ancient Sumerians seem to have approached it. Their gods were not merely ideas held inside human minds. They were active presences within the world. They could send rain or withhold it. They could protect a city, abandon it, favour a ruler, destroy an army, or make a harvest fail at the exact moment everyone was already panicking. Which, to be fair, is when divine displeasure tends to become extremely memorable. The world was full of forces that human beings depended on but could not control. Rivers rose, storms appeared over open plains, disease moved through crowded settlements, crops grew or died according to patterns nobody fully understood. The sun crossed the sky every day with impressive reliability, while the moon changed shape and vanished and returned as if it had somewhere more important to be. To modern people, these things may look like natural processes. To an ancient farming society, they were also encounters with power, and power needs a name. The Sumerians gave those powers names, personalities, families, temples, hymns, offerings, and stories. But godship was deeper than any one story. It was the quality that separated the divine from the human. A human being could be brave, clever, wealthy, beautiful, a terrifying warrior, a brilliant builder. He could own fields, command workers, lead troops, and have a title so long it needed its own clay tablet. Still human, still mortal, still dependent on food, water, sleep, and the cooperation of other people who might decide that his leadership was becoming a problem. A god was something else. That does not necessarily mean Sumerian gods were all-powerful in the way later traditions sometimes imagine a single supreme deity. Mesopotamian gods could be angry, impulsive, generous, competitive, deceptive, and occasionally so unpredictable that you would not want to be standing near their temple when the omens looked bad. They were not distant philosophical abstractions floating beyond the universe. They ate offerings, they received music, they had houses in the form of temples. They could be praised, petitioned, offended, soothed, and celebrated. Their statues could be clothed and cared for as though the divine presence was not a vague metaphor, but a real member of the community. That is important. Godship did not mean believing in something invisible. It meant recognizing a category of being whose existence was woven into daily life. The divine was not somewhere far away beyond the stars waiting for humans to die and arrive at a final answer. It was present in the floodwater, the grain yield, the movement of the moon, the outcome of war, and the fragile survival of a city built between two dangerous rivers. So, when Godship appears among the Me, it suggests that divinity was not an optional decoration added after society had already formed. It was part of the framework through which society understood everything else. And maybe that is why the idea has such weight. A city could lose a battle and rebuild. A canal could silt up and be cleared again. A ruler could die, be replaced, and receive a very flattering inscription from his successor. But if the divine order itself seemed broken, if the gods had withdrawn favour, then every human arrangement became unstable. The walls were still walls, the granaries were still granaries. The ruler might still be sitting in the palace, insisting that everything was under control. But something more basic had failed, because for the Sumerians, human life did not stand alone. It existed under the shadow of powers older, stronger, and far less predictable than any human institution. And once you accept that premise, a difficult question follows. If divinity is a real status, a fundamental power built into the fabric of existence, how was that power understood among the gods themselves? The answer is that it was not understood as a flat category. The Sumerian universe was crowded with gods, but those gods were not all equal. They had different powers, different territories, different temperaments, different levels of authority. Some ruled over the largest structures of reality. Others watched over individual cities, rivers, fields, animals, crafts, illnesses, or the dangerous little details of ordinary life. There was hierarchy in heaven long before there was hierarchy on earth. At the highest level stood An, or Anu in later Akkadian tradition, the sky god. He represented the vast upper realm, the unreachable height above the human world. But An was not always the god who appeared most directly in everyday myths. He could seem distant, almost like the ultimate source of divine authority rather than the official personally handling every crisis below. Then there was Enlil. Enlil was one of the most powerful gods in the Sumerian world, associated with wind, storms, command, and the force that separated heaven from earth. In many traditions, he is the one whose word carries extraordinary weight. When Enlil decides something, cities tremble. Kings listen. Other gods pay attention. And then there was Enki, also called Ea in Akkadian. Enki was connected with the fresh water deep beneath the earth, with wisdom, craft, creation, cunning solutions, and the kind of intelligence that finds a loophole when everyone else thinks the situation is impossible. If Enlil was command, Enki was strategy. If Enlil was the storm rolling over the plain, Enki was the hidden water flowing beneath it, patient, essential, and impossible to fully control. These gods did not simply exist side by side like names on a list. They operated within a cosmic order. The universe had ranks. Decisions had channels. Authority had boundaries. Even if myths loved showing those boundaries being tested, ignored, or smashed into tiny pieces by an angry deity. And that is one of the most revealing things about Sumerian religion. Their gods were divine, but they were not always peaceful. They argued, they competed, they formed alliances. They made decisions with consequences for the human world. Sometimes one god protected a city, while another turned against it. Sometimes a god's favour could elevate a king. Sometimes that favour could vanish, leaving a ruler with a crown, an army, and the sudden realization that none of it seemed to be working anymore. To the Sumerians, the world was not random, but it was not simple either. It was ordered by powers greater than humanity, yet those powers could be complex, emotional, and in conflict. That meant disaster did not always look like meaningless bad luck. A failed harvest, a flood, a military defeat, or a plague might be understood as a sign that something had gone wrong in the relationship between the human and divine worlds. Not necessarily because people were immoral in some abstract modern sense. Ancient Mesopotamian religion was often much more practical than that. Maybe rituals had been neglected. Maybe a god had been offended. Maybe another divine power had made a decision that humans could not yet understand. Maybe the city had simply lost the protection it once possessed, which is a terrifying way to interpret a drought. Imagine spending your entire life beside rivers that could feed your fields or destroy them. Imagine seeing the mud brick walls of your city rise above flat open land, knowing that beyond those walls were rival cities, raiders, disease, hunger, and weather patterns that could erase a year's labour in a few days. You would want the cosmos to have an order, but you would also want to know where you stood inside it. That is why divine hierarchy mattered. It made the unseen world legible, not fully predictable, because no ancient Mesopotamian would have been foolish enough to think the gods could be reduced to a schedule, but legible enough that people could act. They could pray to the proper deity. They could read omens. They could make offerings. They could seek signs. They could try to understand whether a disaster was local, temporary, cosmic, or political. And often those categories overlapped. A city was not just a human settlement. It could be imagined as belonging in a special way to its patron deity. Hur belonged to Nanna. The moon god Uruk was bound to Inanna. Nippur was especially associated with Enlil, Eridu with Enki. The gods were not merely worshipped inside these places. In the religious imagination of Mesopotamia, the city and its divine protector were tied together at the deepest level. If a city prospered, that could be read as evidence of divine favour. If it fell, the question was unavoidable. Had its god abandoned it? Mesopotamian laments, written after the destruction of cities, can feel almost painfully direct on this point. The ruins are not described as the result of military logistics alone. They are presented as a catastrophe permitted, ordered or mourned within the divine realm. Human armies may have carried the torches, human kings may have issued the commands, but behind the visible event stood a decision made somewhere higher. That idea can sound fatalistic, but it also gave history a shape. The rise and fall of cities was not just chaos, it was part of a larger drama, even when the people living through it had no idea what the next act would bring. And if you like mysteries where ancient people tried to decode a world far larger than themselves, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with the link in the description. Now, there is an important caution here. We should not imagine that every Sumerian, across every century, held one perfectly identical map of the heavens. Sumer lasted for an enormous stretch of time. Cities had their own traditions. Priests, poets, kings and scribes emphasized different gods in different contexts. Later Akkadian and Babylonian traditions reshaped earlier material, sometimes preserving it, sometimes changing it, sometimes making the ancient divine family tree look like it had been assembled during an argument. So the hierarchy was real, but it was not frozen. It shifted with politics. It shifted with the fortunes of cities. It shifted as one god became more prominent and another receded. When Babylon rose to power much later, Marduk rose with it, eventually receiving authority that earlier traditions had distributed more broadly among other gods. That is not an accident. In Mesopotamia, heaven and earth reflected one another constantly. A powerful city wanted a powerful god. A king claiming wider control needed cosmic language large enough to support the claim. Divine order could provide that language, but it could also limit human ambition. No king, however mighty, was supposed to be the ultimate source of order. He ruled beneath the gods. He could claim their favour, carry out their decisions, and present himself as their chosen servant. But the authority above him remained older than his dynasty and more permanent than his palace. And that brings us to the next strange part of Godship, because if the divine world had rank, command and order, then those powers could not remain vague ideas floating somewhere above the clouds. They had to enter the human world in specific ways. That is where the temple enters the story. To a modern visitor, a temple can look like a building for worship, a place people go to pray, make offerings, ask for help, and then return to ordinary life. But in ancient Sumer, the temple was not separate from ordinary life. It was the centre of it. The god did not merely have a temple in the city. In a very real religious sense, the temple was the god's household. It was the place where the deity was believed to dwell on earth, receive food, hear petitions, accept gifts, and exercise authority over the land and people connected to that divine power. And this is why gods needed institutional roles. A god who controlled a city, a river, a field, a craft, or the fate of a kingdom could not remain an abstract force. That God needed servants, property, storehouses, ritual schedules, records, fields to generate offerings, workers to maintain sacred spaces, specialists who knew the correct hymns, prayers, purifications, festivals and ceremonies. In other words, divine power needed administration. That may sound almost too practical for religion, but practical was exactly what Mesopotamian religion often was. The gods governed a dangerous world, so humans had to maintain the relationship that kept the world functioning. Picture a city before sunrise. Workers are already moving through narrow streets. Grain is being measured, beer is being prepared, animals are being brought for sacrifice. Textiles are carried into storerooms. Scribes press marks into wet clay, recording deliveries and distributions. Priests prepare for rituals that must happen at the right time, in the right order, with the right words. None of this was just background activity. It was part of the mechanism holding the city together. The divine statue inside the temple was especially important. To us it might seem like an object made by human hands. And technically, of course, it was. Craftsmen carved it, decorated it, dressed it, and maintained it. But in Mesopotamian religious thought, once properly consecrated, the statue could become the living presence of the deity in the human realm. It could be washed, clothed, fed, carried in procession, protected during danger, not because people thought a god was literally hungry in the ordinary human sense. The rituals were more profound than that. Feeding the god's image was a way of acknowledging dependence. The city existed because divine favour made order possible. The offerings were not payment in a simple business transaction. They were maintenance of a relationship between the visible and invisible worlds. And relationships require work. This is one reason Mesopotamian myths sometimes describe humans as being created to serve the gods. The details vary from text to text, and we should be careful not to treat one myth as a complete summary of what every Sumerian believed. But the broad idea appears again and again. Human beings have obligations. The gods have needs, expectations, and plans. Civilization exists partly because someone has to keep the sacred system running. That system had institutions because the gods had responsibilities. A city's patron deity needed a household capable of receiving produce, redistributing goods, funding construction, employing labourers, and supporting rituals. The temple could own fields, herds, workshops, fishing rights, and storehouses. It could organise large numbers of people. It could function as a religious centre, yes, but also as an economic one. This is where ancient Sumer becomes startlingly recognisable. Before palaces dominated every aspect of political life, temple institutions were already managing resources on a serious scale. They needed accounting. They needed standardized measures. They needed seals to mark ownership and authority. They needed scribes who could track what came in, what went out, who worked, who received rations, and which offerings were due. Some of the earliest writing from Mesopotamia is not poetry or philosophy. It is administration, lists of grain, counts of livestock, records of labour, deliveries of beer, inventories of textiles. At first glance, that can feel disappointingly ordinary. You expect the dawn of writing to begin with a cosmic revelation, and instead you find someone apparently worrying about sheep and barley. But that is the revelation. Civilization did not emerge only from kings dreaming of glory or priests staring into the stars. It also emerged from the need to coordinate human effort around institutions believed to be sacred. If a god's household had land, workers, offerings, festivals, and obligations, then somebody had to remember all of it. Clay tablets remembered, and because the temple was a divine household, its staff were not just employees in the modern sense. They were serving a power that stood above the city. The priest, the singer, the brewer, the herder, the gardener, the scribe, the cleaner, the craftsperson making ornaments for a statue, all could be participating in a system with cosmic meaning. Even time itself had to be organized. Festivals occurred on particular days. Rituals had seasonal rhythms, agricultural cycles had religious significance. When canals needed clearing, when fields needed planting, when harvests arrived, when floodwaters rose or failed to rise, these were not merely technical concerns. They became moments when humans had to respond correctly to the conditions of the world the gods controlled. And when things went wrong, the institution gave people somewhere to turn. A drought was not solved by prayer alone. Fields still needed irrigation. Grain still had to be rationed. Canals still had to be repaired. But prayer, sacrifice, divination, and ritual gave disaster a structure. They allowed people to ask what had happened, which power might be involved, and what action could restore balance. That does not mean the system always worked. Cities still fell, crops still failed, epidemics still came, temples could be looted, abandoned, rebuilt, or carried off into exile along with the divine statues they housed. And when that happened, the crisis was more than political or economic. It could feel as though the god's presence itself had been torn away from the city. Imagine watching invaders remove the statue of your patron deity. You are not just seeing treasure stolen. You may be watching your city's protector leave. That is how seriously divine institution could be taken. Godship was not a distant theological idea. It had buildings, workers, fields, laws, calendars, songs, storehouses, and clay tablets. It entered human life through systems people could see, touch, and depend upon. And that may be the deeper point behind this ancient divine law. Before human rulers claimed authority, before royal dynasties built their monuments, The Sumerians imagined authority as something already present in the universe. Humans did not invent it from nothing. They received it, served it, recorded it, and tried desperately to survive beneath it. But eventually someone had to rule the human side of this sacred order, and that is where the crown appears. Number 3. The Exalted and Enduring Crown. And notice the wording. Not just a crown, not merely royal jewellery, not a decorative object placed on a ruler's head so everyone could recognise him from across a crowded courtyard. The Sumerian idea was much bigger than that. The crown was exalted, raised up, treated as something possessing a rank of its own. And it was enduring, meaning its authority was imagined to survive the individual human being who happened to wear it. But before we get to that endurance, we need to understand the first and most important point. In the world of ancient Mesopotamia, the crown was a divine object. That does not necessarily mean every physical crown was believed to have fallen straight from the sky in a literal sense. Ancient texts are not instruction manuals, and their language can be poetic, ritualized, and symbolic. But the underlying idea is clear enough. The power represented by the crown did not begin with humans. It belonged to the gods. This is one of the strangest and most revealing features of Sumerian political thought. A king could be powerful. He could command soldiers, collect taxes, build canals, sponsor temples, settle disputes, and punish enemies. But none of that by itself made kingship legitimate. Force could make a man feared. Divine approval made him king. Picture a ruler standing before the people of a city. Around him are officials, priests, soldiers, workers, merchants, and farmers. He may be dressed in expensive wool. He may carry a staff or weapon. He may sit on a raised platform while others stand below him. But the most important thing about him is not his strength, wealth, family, or personality. It is the invisible claim behind the visible symbols. The gods chose him, or at least that was what the system required people to believe. The crown made that claim visible. It was the object that turned political power into sacred authority. It told the city that this person was not merely the strongest man in the room. He was acting under a power older than the city, greater than the city, and capable of judging the city. That distinction mattered because Mesopotamia was never an easy place to rule. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates could be incredibly fertile. It could support dense populations, large cities, trade networks, workshops, temples, and armies. But it was also vulnerable. Floods could be destructive rather than helpful. Canals could silt up. Drought could shrink harvests. Rival cities could attack. Disease could spread through crowded settlements. In that kind of world, leadership could not be presented as a private luxury. It had to be presented as a cosmic necessity. Someone needed the authority to organize labor, defend walls, maintain irrigation, distribute grain in bad years, and make decisions when every possible choice carried danger. The crown represented the right to do those things. But more than that, it represented the burden of doing them correctly. Because if the ruler failed, the consequences could be interpreted in religious terms. A failed harvest was not always simply bad weather. A military defeat was not always simply poor strategy. A plague was not always simply disease. These events could raise a terrifying question. Had divine favour been withdrawn? And if divine favour could be withdrawn, then a crown was never just a prize. It was a responsibility held under constant pressure. The king wore the symbol of divine authority, but he was also exposed to divine judgment. That is why Sumerian rulers spent so much effort connecting themselves to temples and gods. Their inscriptions often present them as builders, restorers, servants, beloved figures, or chosen agents of particular deities. They rebuilt sanctuaries. They dug canals in a god's name. They offered gifts. They claimed victories with divine help. Modern readers sometimes see this as propaganda, and of course it could serve political purposes. Rulers wanted people to accept their authority, but calling it propaganda alone misses something important. The king may have genuinely existed within a worldview where power was dangerous precisely because it belonged, ultimately, to someone else. The gods. And this is where the language of the divine laws becomes so fascinating. In Sumerian tradition, the fundamental structures of civilized life were not imagined as inventions that humans slowly figured out on their own. They were divine powers, divine offices, divine decrees, things that existed before human society could properly function. The crown belonged in that category. It was part of the sacred equipment of order. Like the temple, the throne, the scepter, and the royal insignia. The crown was a material form carrying an invisible reality. You could touch it. You could make it from precious materials. You could place it in a temple or wear it during ceremony. But its true value was not in the metal, beads, cloth, or stones. Its value was in what it connected, earth to heaven. Human decision to divine order. One mortal body to an authority that was supposed to stand above every mortal body. And if you want to go deeper into the ancient mysteries that still resist easy explanation, our book about 12 unexplained mysteries is available on the website, with a link waiting in the description. Now, this divine status created an uncomfortable possibility. If the crown belonged to the gods, then the person wearing it was never entirely secure. He could be chosen, but he could also be rejected. That was the paradox at the center of ancient kingship. The crown was meant to endure. The king was not. Every ruler aged. Every ruler became sick. Every ruler could lose a battle, anger, powerful families, fail to provide grain or die suddenly before anyone had prepared for what came next. And when one human being died, the entire city faced a dangerous question. Who carries the authority now? In a small village, that problem might be settled by custom, family influence, or whoever was strong enough to take control. But a city with temples, canals, warehouses, labour forces, armies, and thousands of people could not afford a long pause. Water still had to move through the canals, grain still had to be measured and stored. Workers still had to be organised, enemies still had to be watched. The city needed continuity, even when the ruler did not survive. That is what the enduring crown represented. Not immortality for the individual king. Quite the opposite. It was a way of admitting that individual rulers were temporary. They came and went, but kingship itself was supposed to remain. The office outlived the office holder. Think about how radical that idea is. A crown is an object, a king is a person. One can be inherited, transferred, ritually bestowed, taken away, lost, restored, or claimed. The other will eventually die by attaching authority to the crown, rather than only to the body of one ruler. Mesopotamian political thought created something larger than any single man. A ruler could present himself as powerful, chosen, even exceptional. But the authority he possessed was never supposed to vanish into the grave with him. It moved on to a son, perhaps, to a brother, to another branch of the ruling family, or, in moments of crisis, to a completely new dynasty claiming that the gods had changed their minds. And that last possibility is essential. Dynastic continuity was important in Mesopotamia, but it was never as simple as saying, the oldest son automatically rules forever. Sometimes succession probably did follow family lines smoothly. A king could spend years preparing an heir, introducing him to officials, assigning him responsibilities, securing support from priests, military leaders, and elite households. In the best possible case, the old king died, and the new king stepped forward with little disruption. The crown remained. The city continued. The gods, it could be said, had allowed the proper order to carry on. But ancient Mesopotamian history was rarely that tidy. The region was divided among competing cities. Uruk, Kish, Lagash, Nippur, Umma, and many others rose, declined, fought, traded, and changed alliances across centuries. A ruler might build a powerful kingdom in one generation, only for his successors to lose control a few decades later. Dynasties ended, cities fell, new centres of power appeared, and through all of it, the basic idea of kingship survived. This is where the old Sumerian king list becomes so strange and so revealing. The text presents kingship as something that could be lowered from heaven, then held by one city before being transferred to another. Its earliest portions include impossibly long reigns and legendary rulers, so historians do not treat it as a simple factual record. It is part memory, part political statement, part sacred history. But its message is unmistakable. Kingship was not destroyed when one city lost it. It was transferred. The crown, in other words, was imagined almost like a current moving through history. It could rest in one place for a time, then leave. A city might become great because it possessed legitimate rule, and when that city was defeated, conquered, or abandoned, later rulers could explain the disaster in a terrifyingly simple way. The divine order had moved elsewhere. That belief gave political collapse a meaning people could understand. It also gave new rulers a way to justify themselves. A conqueror did not have to say only, "I won because my army was stronger." He could say something much more powerful. "The gods gave me the crown." That claim did not erase violence. It did not make succession peaceful. In fact, it may have made struggles for power even more intense, because whoever gained control needed more than soldiers. He needed recognition. He needed temples, officials, cities, and subjects to accept that the transfer was legitimate. A man could seize a palace, but could he make people believe the crown had truly passed to him? That was the real test. And this is why dynasties worked so hard to connect themselves with the past. Rulers restored old temples. They invoked earlier kings. They preserved family lines in inscriptions. They named children after ancestors. They presented themselves not as dangerous newcomers, but as rightful continuers of a sacred chain. Sometimes that chain was biological. Sometimes it was political. Sometimes it may have been almost entirely invented after the fact. But the need for continuity remained constant, because people living under a dynasty did not just want a powerful ruler today. They wanted some reason to believe that the world would still hold together tomorrow. They wanted to know that when the king died, the canals would not fail, the granaries would not be looted, the army would not dissolve, and the gods would not abandon the city. The enduring crown was a promise against chaos, not a guarantee. Mesopotamian history gives us far too many ruined cities to pretend it was a guarantee, but it was a promise, and like all powerful promises, it had to be made visible. And that is exactly what the archaeological record gives us. Not a single perfect crown sitting untouched in a palace vault, with a label saying, "This belonged to the king of Sumer." Ancient Mesopotamia almost never makes things that easy. What survives instead is a scattered trail of images, fragments, ornaments, seals, statues, and burials. Each one gives us a glimpse of how people imagined authority sitting above the human body. And again, the head matters. Look at the rulers carved on stone votive reliefs and statues from southern Mesopotamia. Their clothing is important. Their posture is important. Their inscriptions are important. But the head is often what separates ordinary people from someone occupying a special place in the order of the world. Sometimes the ruler wears a close-fitting cap or rounded headdress. Sometimes there is a band around the head. In later Mesopotamian art, kings may appear with distinctive royal caps, while gods are marked by horned crowns. That distinction matters. The horned crown belonged above all to divine figures, not ordinary human rulers. A king might stand close to the gods, serve them, receive power from them, even be praised in language that sounds almost divine. But the imagery usually preserved a line between the human ruler and the fully divine being. That line was political and dangerous, because the king needed to look more than human without claiming too much. He had to appear elevated above everyone else in the city, yet still dependent on the gods who stood above him. The royal headdress became part of that balancing act. It announced rank without necessarily turning the king into a god. The most famous evidence comes from the royal cemetery at Ur, dating to roughly the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. Archaeologists uncovered extraordinary head ornaments made from gold, silver, and lapis lazuli. There were wreaths of golden leaves, strings of beads, floral decorations, and elaborate headdresses placed with elite burials. The objects are breathtaking. Gold leaves shaped like poplar and willow, lapis imported from far beyond Mesopotamia, probably through trade networks reaching toward what is now Afghanistan, silver hair rings, beaded bands, ornaments designed to catch light and transform the person wearing them into something unmistakably set apart. But historians have to be careful here. Many of these famous pieces were found with women, attendants, and high-status individuals in the cemetery, not securely identified kings. They should not simply be called royal crowns because they look impressive. Archaeology can show us splendor. It cannot always tell us exactly what title the wearer held, or what every ornament meant in the mind of the people who made it. Still, the larger message is hard to miss. In early Sumerian society, the head could become a stage for wealth, rank, ceremony, and identity. The materials themselves carried meaning. Gold did not rot like cloth. Lapis came from distant lands. Fine metalwork required skilled labour, controlled resources, and powerful networks of exchange. To wear such objects was to display access to the world beyond the ordinary household. A crown, a band, a ceremonial cap, or an elaborate headdress did not need words to make an argument. It said, "This person stands apart. This person is recognized. This person belongs to an order that reaches beyond daily life." And the images become even more revealing when we turn to cylinder seals. These were small carved stone cylinders rolled across wet clay to create repeated scenes and inscriptions. They functioned a little like signatures, official stamps, and tiny portable declarations of identity all at once. On them, kings, officials, worshippers, and gods appear in highly structured scenes. No one is standing randomly. One figure approaches another. A deity sits enthroned. A ruler is led into divine presence. An attendant raises a hand in respect. The clothing, posture, and headgear tell the viewer who has authority and who does not. That is the thing about crowns and crown-like headdresses. Their power depends on recognition. A stranger might see gold and think only of wealth. But someone inside the culture could read much more. They could see office, rank, ritual status, and perhaps a claim to legitimate rule. The object was not just decoration. It was a symbol people had been trained to understand. And if you enjoy these moments where ancient objects seem to be hiding a much larger story, there's a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with the link in the description. Now imagine what this meant in a crowded Sumerian city. Most people did not read royal inscriptions. Literacy existed, but it belonged largely to trained scribes and elite institutions. A farmer, labourer, boatman, herder, or craft worker might never hold a tablet containing a king's titles. But they could see a procession, they could see the palace guards, they could see the ceremonial clothing, and they could see what was placed on the ruler's head. The crown made authority visible even to people who could not read its explanation. It turned an invisible claim into a public fact, or at least into something that looked like a fact. That distinction is important. A crown could announce legitimacy. It could not create it by itself. If crops failed, enemies invaded, officials rebelled, or temples rejected the ruler, even the most magnificent headdress could become an empty shell. Ancient people understood that power had to prove itself. The king was expected to protect the city, maintain order, honour the gods, and provide for the institutions that kept life functioning. But when those expectations were met, the crown condensed all of that into one unforgettable symbol. A small object above the head could represent a whole city's idea of order. It could say that authority had a place, that power had rules. That rule was more than force, and once a civilization has created a symbol like that, it becomes almost impossible to separate the ruler from the seat on which he rules. The crown declared who held authority, but another object declared where that authority resided. The throne, number 4, the Throne of Kingship. And this is where the idea becomes much bigger than a chair. To us, a throne sounds like furniture. A large decorated seat in a palace. Wood, stone, ivory, gold. Something a ruler sits on while officials bow, petitioners wait, and guards stand nearby. But in the Sumerian imagination, the Throne of Kingship could mean something far more powerful. It represented the office itself, not simply the person currently ruling. Not his family, not his strength, his wealth, or even his army. The throne represented the legitimate position from which command could be given, laws could be enforced, offerings could be organized, and a city could claim that its ruler had the right to rule. That is a subtle distinction, but it changes everything. A man can die, a dynasty can collapse, a palace can burn, but the office can continue. Think about what that means in a world of city-states constantly competing with one another. Uruk rises, Kish rises, rises, Lagash rises. One city gains influence, then loses it. One ruler wins a war, then vanishes from the records. Another appears claiming ancient titles and divine favour. From our modern distance it can look chaotic, a maze of unfamiliar names, broken tablets, and kingdoms lasting only a few generations. But beneath the chaos was an idea of continuity. Kingship was not necessarily destroyed just because one king was gone. It could pass, it could be bestowed, it could be taken away. The throne remained the symbolic place where that authority existed, waiting for its next holder. And this is one of the strangest things about ancient rule. The king may have looked like the centre of the system, but the system was never supposed to belong entirely to him. He occupied an office larger than his individual life. He sat on the throne, but in an important sense, the throne did not belong to him. He belonged to it. That is the difference between a warlord and a king. A warlord rules because he has fighters behind him. His authority lasts as long as fear, loyalty, and military success last. If he loses a battle, someone stronger may take his place. Nothing deeper needs to change. Power simply moves to the person with more weapons. But kingship, at least in its ideal form, makes a different claim. It says power has a proper seat. It says rule is an office with duties, customs, rituals, and expectations. It says that the person on the throne is not merely powerful. He is recognized as the one who should exercise power. That claim could be disputed, of course. Ancient Mesopotamian politics was not peaceful. Rival cities fought brutal wars. Rulers seized territory, captured rivals, and proclaimed victories in language so exaggerated it can sound almost unbelievable. Every king wanted people to think his rule was inevitable. But the very need to make that argument tells us something. If raw force were enough, no one would need to explain why the gods supported them. No one would need inherited titles, temple ceremonies, royal inscriptions, or symbols of office. A victorious general could just declare himself master and be done with it. Instead, rulers repeatedly framed their authority as something received, something entrusted, something that had to be publicly recognized. The Throne of Kingship gave that idea a form people could understand. It made abstract authority visible. You could point to a seat, a dais, a ceremonial space, and say, this is where judgment comes from. This is where orders become binding. This is where the city's relationship with divine order is made real. And because it was an office, it could move from one human being to another without losing its basic identity. Picture a ruler dying suddenly. Maybe disease, maybe war, maybe old age, maybe an assassination hidden behind the polite silence of surviving records. The city cannot simply stop. Canals still need maintenance. Fields still need workers. Trade still needs protection. Temples still need offerings. Disputes still need judgment. Enemies may be watching the walls, so another person has to take the seat. A son, perhaps, a brother, a chosen successor, a military leader. In moments of crisis, maybe someone with no obvious family claim at all. The individual changes, but the throne remains. That continuity was reassuring, and it was also dangerous, because if kingship is transferable, then every transfer raises a terrifying question. Who has the right to receive it? Is the new ruler the legitimate holder of the office? Has he been properly installed? Does the city accept him? Do the temples accept him? Can he defend the people, maintain the canals, feed the workers and keep enemies away? Or is he simply a man who has managed to sit down in the right chair? That tension runs through Mesopotamian history. The throne was never just a reward for victory. It was a burden, a claim, and a test. The person who held it was expected to demonstrate that he could carry the weight of an authority believed to be greater than himself. And that raises an even deeper question. If the throne was an office that could pass from ruler to ruler, then where did that office exist before any human ruler received it at all? According to the Sumerian religious imagination, it existed with the gods. More specifically, many of the Mi were kept in the custody of Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water, craft, cunning, and the deep subterranean waters the Sumerians called the Abzu. Enki was not just another god in a crowded pantheon. He was the keeper of hidden knowledge, the planner, the problem solver, the divine figure who understood the mechanisms beneath the surface of the world. And that makes him exactly the god you would expect to guard something like kingship. Because kingship was not simply power. Anyone can grab a weapon. Anyone can gather followers. Anyone can make people obey for a while. But creating a stable order, one that organizes labor, settles disputes, manages water, commands armies, supports temples, and holds a city together through famine and war, that requires something deeper. It requires knowledge, it requires rules, it requires the invisible architecture of society. That was Enki's territory. The surviving Sumerian texts do not give us a modern handbook with a neat chapter titled, How Enki Stored the Throne of Kingship. Ancient mythology rarely works that way. It speaks through stories, lists, hymns, and ritual language. Meanings overlap. Different texts emphasize different details, and the tablets that survive are only fragments of what once existed. But the broader pattern is remarkably clear. The Mi were divine powers, essential capacities of civilization, and Enki possessed them at his sacred city of Eridu. Eridu was ancient even by Sumerian standards. Located in the far south of Mesopotamia, near the marshes and waterways that made life possible in a harsh land, it was remembered as a place of beginnings, a city connected to water, creation, and the first ordering of the world. That detail matters. Before there could be kings, there had to be cities. Before there could be cities, there had to be irrigation. Before irrigation, there had to be knowledge of water, land, seasons, labour, and cooperation. In southern Mesopotamia, water was life, but it was never simple. Too little water and crops failed. Too much water and fields flooded. A canal blocked by silt could threaten an entire community. A breached embankment could turn months of work into mud. The people living there could not survive by acting alone. They needed planning across seasons. They needed coordinated labour. They needed someone, or some institution, capable of saying when to dig, where to build, who would work, and how food would be distributed. In other words, they needed the foundations of organised rule. And in mythic terms, those foundations were not invented casually by humans one afternoon. They were held in divine custody. Picture Enki in the Abzu beneath his temple at Eridu. Not a historical king sitting in a measurable room, but a mythic image of deep order hidden beneath the visible world. Above ground, people struggle with harvests, conflict, sickness, trade, birth, death, and the endless uncertainty of the river plain. Beneath it all is Enki, guardian of the powers that make civilization possible. The Throne of Kingship belongs in that collection because it is one of those powers. Not a chair, not an ornament, a principle. The principle that there must be a recognized center of command when a community becomes too large to run on personal relationships alone. Think about a small village. Everyone knows everyone. If a dispute breaks out, families may settle it face to face. If a house needs repair, neighbours help. If food is scarce, the problem is immediate, local, personal. Now expand that village into a city of thousands. Suddenly, there are strangers. There are storehouses, temples, work gangs, merchants arriving from distant places, fields beyond the walls, canals stretching for miles, labourers who need rations, soldiers who need organising, priests with ritual calendars, craftspeople dependent on supplies they cannot gather themselves. At that scale, society needs more than goodwill. It needs authority that people recognise, even when they do not personally know the person exercising it. That is what the Throne of Kingship represented, and the Sumerians placed that authority in Enki's keeping because, in their view, civilization itself had a sacred source. Human beings could carry out the work. They could build walls, dig canals, issue commands, and fight wars. But the underlying pattern, the legitimate order that made those actions meaningful, came from beyond them. This is a radically different way of thinking about power. Modern people often ask, who is in charge? The Sumerian question may have been closer to, by what sacred order can anyone be in charge at all? That is why the me are so fascinating. They blur categories we like to keep separate. Religion, politics, technology, art, warfare, sexuality, law, kingship, ritual, and craftsmanship all appear as parts of one larger system. The world works because each force has its place. Civilization survives because its essential powers are properly possessed, properly enacted, and not used recklessly. And if you want to explore more of the mysteries ancient people left behind, including stories and discoveries that still resist easy explanation, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description. Now, Enki's custody of the me was not merely passive. In one of the most intriguing Sumerian myths, these powers do not remain safely locked away forever. They become the subject of a divine encounter involving Enki and another major deity, Inanna of Uruk. And what happens next reveals something important about kingship itself. Divine authority may have a heavenly source, but civilization only changes when that authority enters the human world. That idea appears with extraordinary force in one of the most famous documents ever recovered from ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerian king list. At first glance, it looks like exactly what the name suggests. A list of cities, a list of kings, a list of reigns. But then you read the opening line. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Not created in Eridu. Not seized in Eridu. Not voted into existence by the people of Eridu. Descended from heaven. That single phrase tells us how the Sumerians imagined political authority at its deepest level. Kingship did not begin as a human invention. It was a divine reality that entered the world, took root in a city, and was exercised through mortal rulers. And notice the wording. The text does not say a particular king descended from heaven. It says kingship did. The office came first. The throne came first. The individual ruler was temporary. That is the same distinction hidden inside the idea of the throne of kingship as a me. A man could sit on a throne, he could issue orders, lead armies, build temples, collect grain, punish rebels, and claim glory in inscriptions. But none of that made him identical with kingship itself. Kingship was bigger than the king. It existed before him, and after he died it continued. The Sumerian king list begins in the deep, almost mythic past, with rulers whose reigns are so long they sound impossible to modern ears. The earliest kings are said to have ruled for tens of thousands of years. One ruler reigns for 28,800 years. Another for 36,000. Together, the first dynasties rule for periods that stretch across hundreds of thousands of years. Were these historical records in the modern sense? Almost certainly not. No serious historian thinks ancient kings literally sat on a throne for 43,200 years. But dismissing the list as nonsense misses the point. The enormous numbers were doing something. They place the first age of kingship beyond ordinary human time. Before history as the Sumerians knew it, before the great cities they could recognize, before the world had settled into its familiar rhythm, kingship was already present. It had come from heaven. Then, according to the king list, came the flood. The text says, "Then the flood swept over." Just like that. One sentence, and the first world ends. Afterward, kingship descends again. It appears at Kish, then passes through a long sequence of cities. Uruk, Adab, Mari, Akshak, Akkad, and others. Each city has its dynasty, each dynasty rises, each dynasty falls, and each time the list uses a phrase that is almost mechanical in its repetition. Then city was defeated, and its kingship was taken to another city. This is where the king list becomes more than a record of rulers. It becomes a map of sacred legitimacy. To us, the shifting of political power from one city to another might look like the usual story of war. One army wins, another loses. A capital is conquered. A new dynasty takes control, but the Sumerian account adds another layer. A city did not merely lose a battle, it lost kingship. And another city did not merely gain territory, kingship was taken there. That language turns political change into something cosmic. The throne was not simply furniture inside a palace. It was a divine charge that could rest upon one city, then depart when that city fell out of favour, was overcome by enemies, or could no longer hold the order entrusted to it. Imagine what that meant for the people of Mesopotamia. You live in a walled city, surrounded by fields, canals, marshes, and rival powers. The future is never secure. a bad harvest can bring hunger. A canal can fail. Nomadic raiders can appear on the horizon. A rival city can cut off trade. Disease can move through crowded streets. And then, one year, the army of another ruler arrives. The gates fall, the palace is seized, the old king disappears. In modern language, you might say the government has collapsed. But in Sumerian religious language, something even more serious has happened. Kingship itself has departed. That idea gave history a pattern. Chaos was not random. Victory was not merely luck. The movement of power between cities reflected a deeper order, even if human beings could not always understand it. Of course, we should be careful here. The Sumerian king list was not a neutral chronicle written by detached observers. It was copied and reshaped over centuries. It combines rulers who are historically attested with legendary figures, separates some dynasties that may have overlapped, and arranges the past into a clean sequence that real history probably never followed. Ancient Mesopotamia was messier than the list makes it seem. Several city-states could be powerful at the same time. Local rulers could govern independently. Dynasties rose and fell for practical reasons: military strength, trade routes, irrigation, alliances, internal conflict. But that is exactly what makes the text so revealing. The king list was not trying to give us a spreadsheet. It was trying to explain why rule mattered. It was trying to show that no king, no matter how mighty, possessed authority entirely on his own. A king could claim divine support. He could present himself as chosen, beloved, or empowered by the gods. But the very existence of the list reminds us that rulers came and went, while kingship endured. The throne outlasted the man sitting on it, and that is the real significance of this divine law. The throne of kingship was the sacred framework behind earthly rule. It transformed raw force into recognized authority. It gave cities a center. It made administration, law, warfare, temple building, and large-scale labor imaginable as parts of one ordered system. Without that idea, a ruler is just the strongest person in the room. With it, he becomes the temporary bearer of a power believed to have descended from heaven itself. And once a civilization believes that authority has a divine source, the next question becomes unavoidable. How does that authority show itself? How can people see it, recognize it, and know who has the right to command? For the Sumerians, the answer was not only found in a throne, it was carried in the symbols of power themselves. Number 5. The Exalted Scepter. If the throne was the place where kingship rested, the scepter was the thing that allowed that invisible power to travel. A throne stays in one room. It stands inside the palace, inside the temple, inside the city that claims to hold divine favor. But a scepter can be carried. It can appear before an assembly. It can be raised during a ritual. It can pass from one ruler to another. It can turn a single human body into something more than a single human body. That was its deeper meaning. To the Sumerians, power was not only an idea. It had to take form. It had to be made visible, recognizable, almost touchable. The Exalted Scepter was one of the me, one of the divine powers that made ordered civilization possible because it gave authority a shape. And that matters more than it may seem. Think about the problem facing the first cities. Thousands of people are living close together. Farmers work fields outside the walls. Labourers maintain canals. Merchants move goods through markets and across rivers. Priests oversee offerings. Craftsmen produce tools, cloth, pottery, and metalwork. Families depend on grain stores that must last through bad seasons. Everyone is connected, but not everyone knows everyone else. In a tiny band of 20 people, status can be personal. You know who is older, you know who is skilled, you know who people listen to. But in a city of tens of thousands, personal familiarity is not enough. How do you make an abstract hierarchy real? How do people recognize that an office exists beyond the individual currently holding it? The answer, in part, is symbols. A crown says this person occupies a sacred rank. A throne says this person sits at the center of rule. And a scepter says the authority attached to that rank is present here, now, in the world of human beings. Not as a vague claim, not as an invisible blessing no one can verify. But as an object held in the hand, the scepter was not powerful because it was expensive wood, polished stone, metal, or some other material. Archaeology cannot always tell us exactly what every ancient scepter looked like, and the objects themselves rarely survive. Wood decays, handles disappear. Precious materials are melted down, reused, or stolen long before modern excavators arrive. But the idea survives in the texts. In the Sumerian imagination, the scepter belonged to the equipment of legitimate rule. It was part of the sacred vocabulary through which the gods organized the human world. Just as the me included kingship, priesthood, truth, wisdom, weapons, crafts, and music, they also included the objects and signs that allowed these powers to be recognized. That is why the scepter was exalted, not merely decorated, not merely prestigious. Exalted, it stood above ordinary objects because it represented something above ordinary human life. A walking stick helps a traveller cross rough ground. A staff can help a shepherd guide animals. A tool helps a worker perform a task. But the exalted scepter was something different. It was a sign that human society had been arranged into ranks, offices, obligations, and sacred relationships. It announced that there was a structure behind the crowd, a centre behind the city, a divine order behind the person holding it. And in Mesopotamia, that order was never taken for granted. This was a world built on unstable ground. The rivers gave life, but they could also flood without mercy. Canals fed fields, but they required constant maintenance. Crops could fail. Armies could arrive. A city that seemed eternal could be conquered in a single season. So objects of authority carried enormous emotional weight. They told people that order still existed, that the city was not just a collection of frightened families behind mud-brick walls, that there was a link, however fragile, between earth and heaven. There is something almost theatrical about it, but not theatrical in the modern sense of pretending. Ritual symbols made invisible beliefs public. They allowed everyone present to participate in the same understanding of reality. When people saw the sacred signs of rule, they were not simply seeing wealth. They were seeing a claim about the universe. The gods had established order. Order had entered the city. The city had a rightful centre. Of course, whether every person accepted that claim is another question. Ancient Mesopotamians were not robots. They experienced corrupt rulers, failed harvests, military defeat, and political intrigue just like people anywhere else. A sacred object could not make grain appear in an empty storehouse. It could not erase fear after an invasion. It could not guarantee that the ruler holding it was wise, capable, or loved. But that is exactly why the symbol mattered. The more uncertain life became, the more powerful the language of divine legitimacy could be. A ruler was mortal. The scepter was a reminder that the authority he carried was supposed to be more than mortal. And that distinction runs all through Sumerian thought. The individual could fail, the office could pass to another person. A city could lose its kingship. Yet the divine principle behind legitimate order remained larger than any one king, any one dynasty, any one generation. The scepter made that principle portable. It took something cosmic and placed it in a human hand. But once authority has been given a visible form, another question rises immediately. What exactly was that bearer of the scepter believed to do with such power? What did the bearer of the scepter actually do? In the simplest sense, he commanded. But command in an ancient city was not just shouting orders at soldiers. It was the ability to make decisions travel outward from a centre and become action in the lives of thousands of people. Open this canal, repair that wall, measure the fields again. Bring grain from the storehouses, send messengers to the neighbouring city. Gather the workers, raise the levy, prepare the offerings. These decisions could determine whether a city survived the year or collapsed into hunger, debt, and violence. That is the practical side of the Exalted Scepter. It represented the right to give an order that others were expected to obey. Not because the ruler was physically stronger than everyone around him. No king, no matter how fearsome, could personally force an entire city to work. Power depended on cooperation. It depended on scribes recording instructions, officials relaying them, foremen organizing labor, guards enforcing boundaries, and ordinary people believing, or at least accepting, that the command had legitimate force. The scepter stood behind that whole chain. It said, "This order does not come from a private individual making a request. It comes from the office entrusted with keeping the city alive." And Mesopotamian cities needed that kind of coordination constantly. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates was fertile, but fertility was never automatic. Fields depended on canals filled with silt. Embankments broke, water had to be directed, divided and controlled. Too little water meant crops failed. Too much water could destroy them. A city without organized labor could watch its agricultural system decay, one neglected season at a time. So when ancient texts speak of rulers building canals, restoring walls, establishing justice, and caring for temples, they are not describing separate jobs. They are describing one enormous responsibility, maintaining order against the forces always trying to pull things apart. The scepter was command made sacred because command itself could be a matter of life and death. But command without judgment becomes something else. It becomes arbitrary power, and the Sumerians understood that rulers had to do more than issue instructions. They had to judge. Now, we should be careful here. We do not have a complete Sumerian legal system preserved from the earliest periods, and the famous law codes most people know, like Hammurabi's, come much later, and from Babylonian tradition. But Sumerian texts, royal inscriptions and hymns make one thing very clear. A good ruler was expected to uphold what they understood as justice, balance, and right order. That could mean settling disputes over land. It could mean deciding who owed labor, grain, silver, or animals. It could mean protecting widows, orphans, and vulnerable households from exploitation, at least in the ideal language of kingship. And yes, ancient ideals and ancient reality were often very different. A king could claim to defend the weak while demanding crushing taxes. An official could speak of justice while taking bribes. A temple institution could promise stability while accumulating immense wealth and land. The people of Mesopotamia knew perfectly well that those in power could abuse it. Their literature is full of laments, complaints, warnings, and stories of human arrogance. But the existence of hypocrisy tells us something important. It tells us there was a standard to violate. When a ruler was accused of failing the city, the problem was not simply that he had been ineffective. It was that he had failed in a sacred duty. He had not used the authority placed in his hand correctly. The scepter, then, was not supposed to mean, I can do whatever I want. It was supposed to mean I have been given the burden of deciding. And deciding is dangerous. Imagine two farmers arguing over a boundary after a flood has erased the markers between their fields. Both claim the same strip of land. One says his family worked it for generations. The other says the water changed the channel, and the land now belongs to him. Behind them stand relatives, neighbours, perhaps labourers who depend on the harvest. A wrong decision can create a feud. A delayed decision can leave fields unplanted. A biased decision can convince an entire family that the city no longer protects them. This is where authority stops being abstract. Judgment enters the daily life of ordinary people. The ruler, or more often the officials acting under royal and temple authority, had to turn conflict into a decision everyone could live with. Not necessarily a decision everyone liked. That is impossible. But one recognized as having force, and that is one of the deepest functions of law in any civilization. Not to make every person happy, to prevent every dispute from becoming revenge. The Sumerians placed this kind of order within a divine framework. Their gods were not imagined as distant creators who made the world and walked away. The gods were involved in boundaries, oaths, kingship, agriculture, storms, fertility, war, and justice. To judge fairly was not merely good administration. It was part of keeping the human world aligned with the larger order of the cosmos. If you enjoy these moments where ancient texts open onto questions that still have no easy answer, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description. But there was another side to judgment, and it was much harsher. A decision only has meaning if there is some power behind it. The city had to protect contracts, boundaries, storehouses, roads, and sanctuaries. It had to restrain theft, violence, rebellion, and invasion. A ruler who could judge but could not enforce judgment was not truly ruling. He was simply offering advice. So the Exalted Scepter also carried the idea of protection. Protection from enemies beyond the walls. Protection from disorder within them. Protection for the fields, the canals, the markets, and the temple precincts on which the city depended. This did not mean every ruler was a gentle guardian. Far from it. The same authority that could protect a city could conscript its people, punish its enemies, and demand obedience with terrifying force. Ancient power was never soft. Behind the promise of order stood the possibility of coercion, and that tension is impossible to ignore. The scepter promised that someone would stand between the people and chaos. But it also reminded them that the person standing there possessed the power to define chaos in the first place. That is where the Exalted Scepter becomes more than a badge of office. It becomes a problem at the heart of civilization itself. Because once a society gives one person or one institution the power to command, judge, and protect, it must also confront the question no sacred object can answer on its own. Who protects the people from the hand that holds the scepter? And that question may be exactly why Mesopotamian rulers surrounded their authority with images. Not just words carved into stone, images, because in a world where most people could not read a long royal inscription, power had to be visible at a glance. You had to know who stood above whom. You had to know where divine authority ended and human authority began. You had to know before anyone spoke that this was not an ordinary man. Mesopotamian royal iconography was designed to make that message impossible to miss. Look at the art of ancient Sumer and the later Mesopotamian kingdoms, and certain patterns appear again and again. The ruler is shown standing before a god. The ruler is shown leading troops. The ruler is shown building temples, defeating enemies, presenting offerings, receiving divine approval. Sometimes he appears larger than the people around him, not because he was literally a giant, but because scale itself was political language. The bigger the figure, the greater the importance. This may seem obvious now, but it was a remarkably efficient visual system. A person looking at a carved stone plaque or a cylinder seal did not need a written explanation. The composition told them how the universe was supposed to work. Gods above, rulers below them, but above ordinary people. Officials, soldiers, priests, captives, workers and worshippers, arranged according to their place in the order. It was hierarchy turned into a picture. And in many of these images, the scepter or staff appears as part of that visual language. Not always in the exact same form, and not always surviving clearly enough for us to identify with certainty. But the basic idea is unmistakable. The ruler holds an object that distinguishes him from those around him. His body, clothing, posture, and ceremonial equipment all announce that he occupies a role no one else can simply claim. This matters because ancient kingship was never just about an individual personality. A king could die, a dynasty could collapse, a city could be conquered. But the office had to appear larger than the person holding it. The images helped accomplish that. They transformed a mortal human being into the visible carrier of an eternal institution. Think about what that meant for a city like Uruk, Lagash, or Nippur. Most people would never stand in a private room with the ruler. They might see him at a festival during a military procession or near a temple ceremony, but they would encounter his image in seals, reliefs, statues, inscriptions, and objects used by officials. They would see the same visual message repeated across different places and materials. The ruler is present. The gods have established order. The institutions of the city endure. Of course, this was propaganda. But propaganda is not the same thing as a lie. It is a carefully chosen version of reality. It tells you what the powerful want people to believe, and that makes it incredibly valuable to historians. When a king has himself shown carrying a basket of mud bricks for a temple foundation, as rulers in Mesopotamian art sometimes do, he is making a claim. He is not saying, "I personally did all the construction." Everyone knew great buildings required vast labour forces. He is saying, "I am the one responsible for this sacred work. I am the builder. I restore what the gods require." When he is shown trampling enemies, he is claiming that he can defend the land. When he is shown approaching a deity with hands raised or offerings presented, he is claiming that his rule has divine backing. And when royal objects appear in these scenes, they are not just decorations. They help turn political authority into something ceremonial, recognizable, and almost cosmic. The most famous early example of this visual world may be the stele of the vultures from Lagash, dating to the early dynastic period. It records a conflict between Lagash and its rival Umma. On one side, the ruler Eonatum leads tightly organized soldiers. On another, the patron god Ningirsu appears as a colossal supernatural force, capturing enemies in a great net. The message is not subtle. Lagash did not merely win because its army was stronger. Lagash won because divine order stood behind it. That is the world in which the Exalted Scepter belonged. A world where authority needed to be seen as more than human ambition. The ruler could not simply say, "Obey me because I have weapons." He had to present himself as the guardian of a structure, stretching from the temple to the field, from the city wall to the heavens. Yet the images also reveal a limit. The king is important, but in much of Mesopotamian tradition, he is not the highest being in existence. The gods remain greater. They grant, withdraw, judge, protect, and destroy. A ruler may wear splendor, carry the marks of office, and stand at the center of public ritual. But he is still, at least in theory, a servant of powers older than his dynasty. That distinction gave royal iconography its strange tension. It glorified the ruler beyond ordinary measure. But it also reminded him that the authority in his hand was not entirely his. And perhaps that is why these images remain so compelling. They are not just portraits of ancient kings. They are arguments in stone, metal, clay, and paint. Arguments about who deserves to rule, what makes power legitimate, and whether human order can ever truly reflect divine order. The scepter was one part of that argument, but it was never alone. A ruler needed an entire language of visible authority. Crowns, robes, weapons, ceremonial emblems, and sacred signs that could tell the world exactly who he was before he ever gave a command. Number 6. Royal insignia. If the scepter was one unmistakable sign of authority, royal insignia were the entire collection of objects that transformed a ruler into a ruler. Not one object, a system, a crown or ceremonial headdress, a robe made from costly materials, a staff, a weapon, jewelry, seals, special garments, emblems connected to gods, cities, military power, or the office itself. Some of these objects were practical, some were symbolic. Some were probably both at once, and that is important, because the phrase royal insignia can sound more specific than the ancient evidence allows. We do not possess a perfectly preserved Sumerian checklist saying, "Here are the 7 objects every king must wear." The records are fragmented. Art is selective. Texts use poetic language, and objects discovered in tombs or temples do not always come with labels explaining exactly who used them or what they meant. But when we put the evidence together, a pattern begins to emerge. Mesopotamian rulers were distinguished through material splendor. Their clothing could be more elaborate than ordinary garments, with fringes, layered fabrics, decorated hems, and sometimes patterned textiles that required immense labor to produce. In a world where cloth was valuable, a finely made robe was not a minor luxury. It represented land, sheep, flax, dye, skilled workers, trade connections, and organized wealth. You were not simply looking at fabric. You were looking at an entire economy gathered around one body. Then there were the headdresses. The horned crown is one of the most famous symbols in Mesopotamian art, but it needs a careful explanation. Horned crowns were primarily associated with gods. When ancient artists showed a deity wearing a crown with multiple pairs of horns, they were marking that figure as divine. Human kings did not normally wear that exact divine crown in the same way, at least not in the surviving Sumerian imagery. But rulers could wear elaborate caps, headbands, helmets, and ceremonial headgear that separated them from everyone else. Sometimes later Mesopotamian kings appear in tall, carefully shaped crowns. Sometimes they wear a rounded cap, sometimes a military helmet. The form could change across centuries, cities, and dynasties. The deeper points stayed the same. The head was where authority became visible. A crown did not have to look identical in every period to communicate the same basic claim. This person occupies a place set apart from ordinary life. Weapons could become insignia too. A mace, an axe, a bow, a sword, or a spear could be a weapon in the simple sense. It could kill, it could defend walls, it could settle a battle. But when it appears in royal contexts, especially in art or ceremonial language, it becomes more than equipment. It becomes a statement about the ruler's capacity to protect order through force. That does not mean every ancient king personally fought in every battle. Royal inscriptions often exaggerate. They turn victories into grand cosmic dramas, with kings crushing enemies by the thousands and gods marching invisibly at their side. We have to read those claims carefully. Still, war was real. City-states competed for land, water, trade routes, labour and prestige. The ruler's weapons represented a harsh truth about early political life. Order was not maintained through prayers alone. Behind the temple, the palace, the granary, and the city gate stood organised violence. Even jewellery could carry this language of rank. Gold, silver, lapis lazuli, carnelian, shell, and other rare materials appear in elite burials and high status objects from ancient Mesopotamia. The royal cemetery at dating to the 3rd millennium BCE, produced extraordinary examples: headdresses of gold leaves and beads, necklaces, pins, weapons decorated with precious metals, and objects made from materials transported across vast distances. Lapis lazuli likely came from far to the east, probably Afghanistan. Carnelian moved through long-distance trade networks. Shell came from distant waters. Gold and silver had to be acquired through exchange, tribute, extraction, or conquest. So when a ruler or high official wore rare materials, the objects may have carried several meanings at once. Wealth, yes. Beauty, certainly, but also access, connections. The ability of a city and its institutions to draw distant places into its orbit. If you enjoy these kinds of ancient mysteries, there's a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with the link in the description. And then there were seals. This may be one of the most overlooked forms of ancient authority because cylinder seals are so small. A seal could fit in the palm of your hand, but roll it across wet clay and it leaves behind a detailed image: gods, worshippers, animals, officials, banquets, conflicts, ceremonies, and sometimes inscriptions naming the owner. In Mesopotamia, seals were not merely decorative jewellery. They could identify individuals and authorize transactions. They were used on tablets, containers, doors, and stored goods. A seal impression could indicate that an order, delivery, agreement, or record had passed through recognized hands. Royal seals, or seals associated with high office, therefore belonged to the broader world of insignia. Not because every seal was royal, but because the power to mark clay was the power to make an action official. A king's authority could travel farther than his voice. It could be pressed into a tablet and carried down river. It could be stamped onto a storehouse door. It could accompany grain, wool, silver, livestock, or messages moving between cities. And that brings us to another kind of royal object, one that sits between the practical and the sacred, the ceremonial standard, emblem or divine symbol connected to a city and its patron god. A city's emblem could work almost like a public signature. It told people which god stood behind a community, which institution controlled a space, and where a ruler claimed to belong. In a landscape divided among competing city-states, that mattered enormously. Hor was not Uruk. Uruk was not Lagash. Lagash was not Nippur. Each had its own traditions, temples, patron deities, rivalries, memories of victory, and claims to ancient importance. A ruler was not legitimate simply because he had soldiers. He had to be recognizable. Think about the problem. Most people in an ancient city would never sit in a council chamber while political decisions were being made. They would not read every administrative tablet. Many may not have been able to read at all. Their experience of authority came through what they could see, hear, repeat, and remember. Who sits in the place of honor? Whose name is spoken in official proclamations? Whose seal appears on the records? Who leads the army? Who brings offerings to the city god? Who is shown building walls, digging canals, restoring temples, defeating enemies, feeding the poor, or dedicating monuments? Royal insignia helped answer those questions before anyone needed to explain them. They made power legible, and that might be the most important thing about them. A ruler's authority was never just a private belief inside his own mind. It had to exist in the minds of thousands of other people. Priests had to recognize it. Administrators had to recognize it. Soldiers had to recognize it. Merchants, laborers, farmers, foreign envoys, and rival elites all had to understand who was giving orders and why those orders carried weight. Without that shared recognition, a king was just a wealthy man wearing expensive things. The ancient Sumerians understood that political order depends on visible distinctions. Not necessarily because ordinary people were fooled by a crown or a robe. Ancient people were not naive. They knew perfectly well that a ruler could fail, lie, lose wars, overtax his people, or anger the gods. Mesopotamian history is full of revolts, dynastic collapses, invasions, and cities changing hands. But symbols gave authority a framework. They created a public language that said, this person is not acting as a private individual. This person is acting in an office. This person stands within an inherited system of divine favour, city tradition, law, military command, temple obligation, and economic administration. That distinction could be the difference between obedience and chaos. Imagine a dispute over irrigation water. Two farming communities need the same canal. The water is low. Planting season is approaching. Both sides believe they have the stronger claim. Who decides? If there is no recognized authority, the answer may be whoever brings the larger group of armed men. But if a ruler is publicly accepted as the guardian of the city's order, then his decision can carry force beyond his personal presence. Officials can enforce it, scribes can record it, temple institutions can acknowledge it. Armed men can act in his name. The decision becomes part of a wider structure. That is what legitimacy does. It transforms personal command into public authority. Of course, the Sumerians did not leave us a modern political theory textbook explaining legitimacy in those exact words. They did not sit around using phrases like state formation or institutional authority. Those are our categories. But their inscriptions, administrative systems, and royal claims reveal that they were intensely concerned with the question, why should this ruler rule? Again and again, Mesopotamian kings answered, because the gods chose him, because the city's patron deity entrusted him with responsibility, because he rebuilt what had fallen into ruin, because he protected the land, because he defeated enemies, because he restored justice, however that word was understood in a particular time and place. And because everyone could see the signs. This is why royal images and official symbols were so politically useful. They did not merely decorate authority after it existed. They helped produce the public recognition that allowed authority to function. A person entering a temple complex, approaching a palace, witnessing an official procession, or receiving an order on a sealed tablet was encountering more than an individual. They were encountering the office made visible. The ruler might be absent. The authority was still there. In fact, this may explain why Mesopotamian kings invested so much energy in having their names written on bricks, cones, statues, vessels, foundation deposits, and monuments. At first glance, it can seem like ancient vanity, and sometimes it probably was. Kings were human. They wanted to be remembered. But there was another purpose. A brick stamped with a ruler's name said that a wall, temple, canal, or gate belonged to an ordered political world. It connected physical space to a specific reign. It announced who had built, restored, funded, or claimed responsibility for the structure. Even centuries later rulers sometimes found the foundation deposits of earlier kings and recorded that discovery with great seriousness. They understood that authority had a history. To rule a city was not only to control it in the present, it was to place yourself in a chain of rulers reaching backward toward the sacred past. And that past, according to the Sumerian tradition, began before human civilization itself. The royal insignia were part of that claim. They suggested that kingship was not an accidental arrangement invented by whoever happened to win the latest battle. It was an ancient order, descending from the gods, passing from city to city, dynasty to dynasty, ruler to ruler. But that raises an uncomfortable question. If legitimacy came from divine approval, what happened when a king lost? If legitimacy came from divine approval, what happened when a king lost? For the Sumerians and for the later Mesopotamian kingdoms that inherited many of their ideas, defeat was never just military bad luck. A lost battle could be read as a cosmic warning. A drought, a flood, a failed harvest, an enemy army at the gates, all of these could raise the same terrifying possibility. Had the god turned away? This is where ritual display became more than ceremony. It became a political necessity. A ruler could not simply declare that the gods still favoured him. He had to demonstrate that the relationship between throne, temple, city and heaven was still functioning. He had to appear in the right places, perform the expected offerings, restore damaged sanctuaries, sponsor festivals, and make visible acts of devotion before the population. Because when the world became unstable, people looked for signs that order could be restored. Imagine a city after defeat. Fields outside the walls may have been burned. Trade routes may be cut. Families may be mourning dead soldiers. Storehouses may be running low. Rumours move faster than official messages. Some say the enemy is returning. Some blame the king. Some blame corrupt officials. Some believe the city's god has been offended. In that moment, a ritual procession is not just a parade. It is a statement. The ruler appears before the god. Priests carry out ceremonies that have been performed for generations. Offerings are brought. Sacred spaces are reopened or repaired. The city witnesses a carefully structured relationship between earthly authority and divine authority. The message is simple, even if nobody says it aloud. The order has been damaged, but it has not disappeared. And that message could matter as much as a new wall or a fresh army of recruits. Modern people sometimes treat ritual as the opposite of practical action. Either you solve a crisis or you perform a ceremony. But in an ancient city-state, the two were deeply connected. Ritual organized people. It reaffirmed institutions. It directed resources. It created moments when elites, temple personnel, soldiers, labourers and ordinary residents could all participate in the same public order. A festival required food, textiles, animals, workers, musicians, guards, priests, administrators and scribes. It activated the machinery of the city, and while that machinery moved, it reminded everyone that the city still existed as something larger than panic. The royal display at the centre of such events helped concentrate that feeling. Not because every person believed the ruler was perfect. Far from it. Mesopotamian texts show plenty of anxiety about bad kings, unjust officials, divine anger, and political disaster. The ideal king was expected to protect the vulnerable, maintain canals, uphold proper boundaries, support temples, and defend the land. Failure in these duties could make royal claims look hollow. But ritual gave the king a chance to show that he understood the burden of office. He was not merely celebrating himself, at least in theory. He was presenting himself as the servant, caretaker, or chosen representative of the god who protected the city. That distinction was crucial. A ruler who displayed wealth without devotion might look arrogant. A ruler who displayed military force without temple support might look like a warlord. But a ruler embedded within the city's sacred rituals could claim to be acting for something older and greater than personal ambition. This is one reason ancient royal inscriptions so often combine political achievements with religious language. A king builds a wall, but he does it for the god. He digs a canal, but he does it under divine instruction. He wins a battle, but the victory belongs to the city's patron deity. He restores a temple, and the restoration becomes evidence that proper order has returned. Of course, we should be careful. These are often royal claims written by people working for rulers. They are not neutral reporting. A victorious king could describe himself as beloved by the gods. A king who seized power after a crisis could insist that heaven had chosen him. Even an usurper might use the language of restoration, claiming he had rescued the city from chaos. That is exactly what makes the pattern so revealing. Nobody felt the need to invent a completely new language of legitimacy. They reached for the old sacred language because people already understood it. And if you enjoy mysteries where ancient beliefs, unexplained traditions, and the hidden logic of the past overlap, there's a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description. Now, think about what this meant politically. Ritual display did not eliminate conflict. It did not stop coups, invasions, famine, or rebellion. But it gave rulers a way to frame those disasters. If a king restored a shrine after a war, he could present recovery as a return of divine favour. If he held a great ceremony after taking power, he could turn a dangerous transition into a sacred renewal. If he marched in a procession with temple officials, he could show that the institutions controlling belief, land, labour, and stored wealth were standing together. That last part may have been especially important. Power in early Mesopotamia was never located in only one building or one person. Temples were powerful. Palace administrations were powerful. Elite families were powerful. Armies were powerful. Cities had their own identities and traditions. A king had to navigate all of it. Ritual created a stage where those competing forces could appear coordinated. The ruler stood at the centre, but he was surrounded by priests, officials, divine images, sacred spaces, and inherited customs. The display said that these forces belonged to one functioning world. When that world held together, kingship could look natural, almost inevitable. When it broke apart, the same symbols could become dangerous. A defeated ruler still wearing the signs of office might be seen not as divinely protected, but as abandoned. A conquered city might watch its sacred objects carried away by enemies and understand the event as more than theft. It could mean that the city's god had left, or been overpowered, or allowed disaster to happen. That is how seriously these objects and ceremonies could be taken. They were not props added to power. They were part of the mechanism by which power survived fear, crisis, succession, and doubt. And that brings us to the deeper Sumerian idea behind all of this. The divine powers were said to exist before civilization, before cities, before fields were measured, canals were cut, and rulers governed from temples and palaces. Royal insignia made that ancient claim visible in the human world. They connected a temporary person, a mortal ruler who could fail and die, to an order believed to be older than any dynasty. But even kingship needed a place where that connection could be renewed, a place where heaven and earth were meant to meet. Number 7. The Exalted Shrine, the place where the connection was renewed. Before there were massive temple platforms rising above Mesopotamian cities, before mud brick ziggurats dominated the skyline, before priests managed huge estates and kings carved their names into foundation deposits, there was something smaller, a sacred place. Maybe it was a simple structure made from reeds, timber, packed clay, and mud brick. Maybe it stood on a slightly raised patch of ground above the floodplain. Maybe it was marked by a doorway, a platform, a boundary wall, or objects whose meaning was known only to the people who gathered there. It would not have looked like the monumental temples most people picture when they hear the word Sumer, but it may have carried the same basic idea. This was a place set apart, a place where ordinary space ended and sacred space began. And that distinction matters, because the earliest shrines were not necessarily created by powerful kings. In many cases they likely existed before kingship took the form we recognize, before palaces, before formal bureaucracy, before a city could command thousands of labourers to build a temple terrace high enough to be seen for miles. The shrine came first. That is the strange thing about the Sumerian divine laws, or Mi. They do not describe civilization as beginning with armies, laws, or crowns. They begin with the deeper conditions that make a human world possible: authority, sacred order, the objects and places through which people understood their relationship to forces beyond themselves. The Exalted Shrine was one of those conditions. Think about the landscape of southern Mesopotamia, thousands of years before the great cities. Flat land, marshes, reeds bending in the wind, rivers changing course without warning. Floodwater bringing life to the soil one year and destruction the next. Small settlements scattered across a world where survival depended on reading seasons, managing water and trusting people beyond your own household. In that kind of environment, a shrine could become an anchor. Not necessarily a grand building, not yet, but a fixed point in an unstable world. Archaeologists have found evidence of increasingly elaborate temple structures at ancient sites like Eridu, a settlement later remembered in Mesopotamian tradition as one of the earliest cities. Beneath later monumental buildings are earlier layers, smaller structures built and rebuilt over long periods of time. The exact meaning of every room and platform is debated. Archaeology can show walls, floors, hearths, objects, and rebuilding phases. It cannot always tell us precisely what people believed when they entered, but the pattern is hard to ignore. Again and again people return to the same sacred locations. They rebuilt on the old foundations. They preserved the place even as the settlement changed around it. Generation after generation, the shrine was not abandoned as a temporary shelter would be abandoned. It was renewed. That tells us something important. The sacred place was becoming more durable than the lives of the people who used it. A child might grow up seeing the same shrine their parents had known, then grow old while younger people repaired its walls. The building might change, expand, collapse, and rise again, but the location retained its force. It held memory. It linked the living to ancestors they had never met and to a future they could not imagine. And if you like following these ancient mysteries into the places where evidence and belief overlap, there's a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description. Now, it is tempting to imagine that early shrines were primitive versions of later temples, as if civilization simply started small and got bigger. But that may miss the point. A shrine is not just a small temple. Its importance comes from separation, from the idea that one place is different from every other place around it. You sleep in one area, you work in another, you keep animals, shape tools, prepare food, bury the dead, and gather with kin. But then there is a place where different rules apply, a place that must be approached correctly, a place where inherited customs matter, a place connected to powers that no individual can fully control. For the Sumerians, that logic eventually became enormous. Their gods had houses, their sacred buildings had names, their precincts required labour, maintenance, land, administrators, and ritual specialists. But behind all that complexity may lie an older human habit. The act of choosing a location and saying, in effect, this is where the world touches something beyond us. And once a community accepts that idea, the shrine begins to change everything around it. Not all at once, not through some single dramatic moment when a village becomes a city overnight, but slowly through repetition, through rebuilding, through the growing conviction that this patch of earth is not merely useful. It is necessary, because a sacred place does more than stand there. It gathers people, memory, labour, and expectation around itself. And that expectation had to be answered, not necessarily with words, not necessarily with some dramatic vision in the darkness, but with actions repeated so often that they became part of the structure of life itself. Offerings, a bowl of grain, fresh bread, dates, milk, beer poured into a vessel, fish from the river, wool, oil, incense, the first portion of a harvest, the best piece of an animal brought to slaughter. objects made by human hands and then removed from ordinary use. To us it can seem strange. Why leave food in a sacred building? Why bring valuable goods to a place where no living person appears to consume them? But that question assumes the shrine was empty. For the people making the offering, it may have been the opposite. The shrine was where the divine presence was most concentrated. Not necessarily visible, not necessarily understood in human terms, but present enough that one had to acknowledge it. And this is where the Sumerian world becomes deeply unfamiliar. The gods were not distant ideas floating somewhere beyond the stars. In later Mesopotamian religion, a god could have a house, a household property, attendants, garments, meals, music, processions, and ritual obligations. The divine being was cosmic in power, but also rooted in a particular sacred location. A god belonged to the heavens, the earth, the rivers, the storms, the grain, the city, and yet was also served in a specific place by specific people. That is not just religion as private belief. That is religion as a relationship maintained through work. Every offering said something. It said, "We remember who provides. We recognize that the harvest is not guaranteed. We know the river can fail. We know sickness can come. We know that no field, herd, family or settlement survives entirely by its own strength. And in return, people hoped for stability, not perfection. Ancient Mesopotamians knew better than to expect that. Their world could be brutally unpredictable. Floods could destroy crops. Drought could turn fertile land hard and cracked. Insects could strip fields bare. Armies could appear over the horizon. A healthy child could fall sick within days. The offering was not a machine where you put in bread and receive rain. It was more like maintaining a bond. Think of it as a relationship with obligations on both sides. Humans served the gods through ritual care, praise, and provisions. The gods, ideally, upheld the order of the world. They kept rivers within their courses. They allowed grain to grow. They defended the community from chaos. When disaster came, people did not necessarily conclude that the gods were imaginary. They might ask whether some duty had been neglected, whether a ritual had been performed incorrectly, whether the divine order had been disturbed by something human beings had done. That could be terrifying, because it meant that ordinary survival had a sacred dimension. Baking bread was not only baking bread, raising animals was not only raising animals. Storing grain, weaving cloth, making beer, shaping a bowl from clay, all of these things could become part of a larger exchange between the human world and the divine one. The shrine gave that exchange a location, and eventually it gave it a schedule. At first, we cannot know exactly how formal these acts were. The earliest communities left no written ritual manuals explaining every gesture. Archaeologists find vessels, animal bones, ash deposits, figurines, platforms, and carefully arranged spaces. These can suggest feasting, sacrifice, storage, or ritual activity. But they do not give us a voice recording from 5,000 years ago telling us precisely what each offering meant. So we have to be careful. Still, later Sumerian texts make one thing unmistakable. Temple ritual was organized around the care of the gods. Divine statues were washed, dressed, adorned, fed, and honored. Hymns describe temples as radiant places, ordered places, places where divine power entered the human world. The statue was not necessarily thought of as a simple decoration. In ritual terms, it could become the body through which a god was encountered. That idea is difficult for modern minds, because we tend to separate symbol from reality. A symbol points towards something else. But for ancient worshippers, the boundary may not have been so clean. When the god's image received food, clothing, or music, the ritual was not just pretending that a god lived there. It was enacting the conditions through which divine presence remained available to the community. And imagine the pressure that created. If the divine household had to be sustained, somebody had to bring the grain. Somebody had to brew the beer. Somebody had to weave the cloth. Somebody had to tend the lamps, clean the floors, prepare the vessels, memorize the words, observe the calendar, and make sure that what was offered was worthy. A shrine was never only a building. It was a promise that these duties would continue tomorrow. That is why offerings mattered so much. They transformed private labour into sacred responsibility. A farmer's grain could become more than food. A shepherd's animal could become more than wealth. A craft worker's bowl could become more than an object for trade. Once it crossed the boundary of the sacred place, it entered another order. And that order had consequences. Because the moment a community begins deciding what belongs to the god, who brings it, who receives it, who guards it, and who has the authority to say the ritual was done correctly, something new begins to take shape around the sacred dwelling. That new thing was the city, not overnight, not because someone woke up one morning and decided to invent urban civilization. Cities emerged slowly, across generations, as people kept returning to the same places for reasons that went far beyond shelter. A good location mattered, of course. Water mattered. Fertile soil mattered. Access to reeds, fish, grazing land, clay, timber, and trade routes all mattered. Southern Mesopotamia was a difficult landscape, but it was also astonishingly productive when people could manage its rivers and canals. But resources alone do not explain why so many settlements grew around sanctuaries. A sanctuary gave people a fixed centre. In a world where families could move, fields could fail, river channels could shift, and political alliances could collapse, the sacred dwelling represented continuity. Your house might be rebuilt, your field boundaries might vanish in a flood, but the god's place was supposed to remain. It was the point around which the community could organize its memory, its obligations, and eventually its identity. This is one reason ancient Mesopotamian cities were not simply collections of homes. They were households gathered around a greater household. The god had a dwelling. The dwelling had land, workers, storerooms, livestock, workshops, and ritual personnel. People brought offerings there, but they also brought disputes. They brought agreements. They brought goods to be measured, redistributed, stored, and protected. A sanctuary could become a place where the scattered labour of hundreds of people was gathered into one visible system. And once that happens, the shrine begins to change the entire landscape around it. Farmers need canals maintained. Grain must be collected after harvest and protected from moisture, insects, theft, and famine. Herds have to be counted. Wool needs to be processed. Beer has to be brewed. Vessels have to be made. Workers need rations. Records need to be kept. At first, perhaps these tasks were managed on a small scale by kin groups and local ritual specialists. But as settlements grew, the sacred centre may have provided the authority needed to coordinate work that no single household could accomplish alone. That is the crucial point. A canal serving one field is manageable. A canal serving an entire settlement is something else. It requires labour from people who may not be related. It requires schedules, decisions, rules, and some method of resolving the argument that always comes next. Who works, who benefits, who gets water first, and who is blamed when the channel breaks. The sanctuary may have helped answer those questions because its authority was larger than any one family. You were not merely digging a canal for your neighbour. You could be maintaining the order that fed the god's city. You were not merely delivering grain into storage. You were sustaining a sacred household whose stability, people believed, was tied to the stability of everyone living around it. That belief could unite people. It could also create power. Because whoever managed the sacred storehouses, the labour gangs, the offerings, and the calendar held an extraordinary position. Priests, administrators, and later kings did not rule in a vacuum. Their authority was often expressed through the language of divine service. They presented themselves not simply as powerful individuals, but as caretakers of the god's domain. And that is where reverence and administration begin to merge. The same building complex that received bread and beer could also receive taxes or tribute. The same officials who supervised ritual distributions might oversee land, labour, livestock, and trade. The same clay tablets used to record offerings could record deliveries of barley, allocations of wool, or the movement of workers. It is tempting to imagine this as a cold bureaucracy suddenly appearing in the ancient world. But it was probably more personal, more sacred, and more complicated than that. A tablet listing grain was not just paperwork. Grain was survival. It was seed for next season, food for families, payment for labourers, and potentially an offering for the divine household. Keeping track of it meant keeping the community alive. If you enjoy these moments where the ancient world becomes stranger and more connected than we expect, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description. Now picture what this meant for ordinary people living near one of these growing sacred centres. There would be more than fields and mud brick homes. There would be movement, farmers arriving with produce, herds being driven in from grazing land, potters, weavers, boatmen, builders, fishers, labourers, merchants, and officials. There would be seasonal gatherings, feast days, processions, shared work, and probably rumours from places far beyond the horizon. A sanctuary drew people together because it gave their meeting a purpose. It turned a settlement into a destination. And destinations grow. Traders prefer places where goods can be exchanged and stored. Craft workers prefer places with customers and access to raw materials. Labourers go where large projects need hands. Families settle where food supplies and social networks are more reliable. Pilgrims, visitors, allies, and envoys arrive because the city is not just a cluster of buildings. It is the place where a god is served. Over time, the sacred centre could become the heart of an urban organism. The city walls, if they came later, enclosed more than people. They enclosed a claim. This was not random ground. This was the territory of a particular divine power, protected, organised, and made meaningful through ritual. To belong to the city was, in some sense, to belong to its god. That does not mean every Sumerian city formed in exactly the same way. Archaeology shows varied local histories. Some settlements expanded because of trade, others because of agricultural opportunity, political advantage, migration, or control of waterways. No single explanation fits every city across thousands of years. But the sanctuary was rarely incidental. It gave social life a centre of gravity. And that may be why the Exalted Shrine belongs among the oldest divine laws. It was not merely a sacred room where people went to pray. It was the principle that the divine needed a dwelling among humanity, and that human life could be ordered around that dwelling. From that principle came gathering. From gathering came shared labour. From shared labour came institutions, records, authority, wealth, rivalry, and cities vast enough to reshape history. The shrine stood at the beginning of all of it, not as a passive monument, but as the place where heaven and earth were believed to meet, and where a scattered population could become a people. And that is the larger pattern behind all 7 divine laws. Lordship, or Enship, established sacred authority before ordinary political power. Godship placed the divine above the human world. The Enduring Crown gave authority continuity. The Throne of Kingship gave it a seat, a centre from which order could be maintained. The Exalted Scepter turned authority into action. Royal insignia made power visible, recognisable, and impossible to ignore. And the Exalted Shrine gave all of it a physical home on earth. According to Sumerian tradition, these were not inventions of early kings. They were gifts that existed before the great cities, before the first dynasties, before humanity was ready to govern itself. Whether we read those claims as literal memory, sacred mythology, or a later attempt to explain the origins of civilization, the idea is still powerful. The Sumerians believed order did not begin with people. People inherited it, and maybe that is why their ancient tablets still feel so strange today. Beneath the stories of gods, crowns, temples, and kings is a question we still ask. Where does authority come from, and who has the right to wield it? If you enjoyed this journey, please like the video, comment with the divine lore that surprised you most, and subscribe for more ancient mysteries. And once again, tell us where you are listening from. The best way to support the channel is by listening on Spotify through the link in the description.